Hello, everyone. Welcome to this at Google Authors Talk. And today we have Ann Lee, who is a senior fellow at Demos, an adjunct professor of economics and finance at New York University, a former hedge fund partner, and a frequent commentator at networks like CNBC, Fox, and CNN. When she worked in China, she was a former visiting professor at Peking University and an economic advisor to Chinese economic officials. And today she is here to talk about her book, What the U.S. Can Learn from China, an open-minded guide to treating our greatest competitor as our greatest teacher. Welcome.
I really want to thank Google for hosting me today. It's such an honor. I flew in from New York, and it's much warmer here. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to come hear my talk, especially to such a serious topic like this, because I know that sex, money, and violence sell, and this book is missing all three. Actually, the other day I was thinking to myself, if my publisher wanted to sell more books, perhaps they should have put on a different cover that was more misleading. Perhaps something with Kim Kardashian walking down the wedding aisle with Yao Ming. That might have been a little bit more National Enquirer. But anyway, I'll get into the book now. Oftentimes, people do ask me, why did I write this book? And it's a particularly interesting question, especially for those who know me, because I had spent at least a decade on Wall Street as a bond trader and a credit derivatives trader. And so I didn't do much writing then. In fact, a friend of mine said to me that I was the only woman he ever met who replied to his emails in one-word sentences. It was either yes, no, or maybe. So obviously, I was very motivated to write an 80,000-word manuscript. And the truth of the matter was that I was very concerned about the direction that the U.S. was headed. And this concern actually started as early as 2005, when I was working at a very large hedge fund. At the time, I was trading credit derivatives and saw many structured product deals come across my desk. And these products are what most people now know to be toxic assets, the ones that caused the 2008 financial crisis. And I had seen a lot of irregularities in these deals. And what confirmed my suspicions were that I had attended some of these broker-dealer dinners where I overheard some of these investment bankers actually brag and joke about the fact that they were able to secure billion-dollar deals, secured with nothing but baseball cards. This was deeply concerning to me, and I even tried to raise the flag with the SEC, suggesting that they investigate this market. But when it became apparent that nothing was going to get done, that was when I decided to leave Wall Street. I had seen previous bubbles, such as the Asian crisis, the internet bubble, and I really believed that this was going to be far worse, and that someone had to warn the public and alert them of what was happening. I went into academia at that point and had proceeded to write a paper detailing how some of this fraud was perpetrated. And I tried to send it to various government officials and the media. In fact, one of my friends who had worked at Fox Business received a copy. And so when I got a call from a Fox producer, I thought that I was being invited to talk about my paper. Unfortunately, she asked me, Ann, can you please come on to debate whether Paris Hilton is a great American hero because she's a big consumer? Unfortunately, I didn't accept that invitation. But that was indicative of sort of the mentality that was going on leading up to the crisis. And so when it finally happened, it was neither surprising or shocking to me. What really actually surprised me was to the extent Wall Street and government having come together. And so when President Obama had Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, the very people that had Wall Street in their back pocket, join his economic team, it wasn't Obama where I was deriving most of my hope for the nation. Interestingly, it was really China. For some of you who may remember, China was a mere backward agricultural society only 30 years ago. In fact, they were written off as a lost cause. So even though China was this great world empire for thousands of years, they had fallen to practically a semi-colonial state 200 years ago when Western nations invaded the nation. And it was very shameful and embarrassing to many Chinese at the time, to folks like Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, who were the Communist Party revolutionaries. When they were intellectuals going to Paris, they experienced firsthand the prejudice and the treatment that was very unfriendly from foreigners. And they attributed a lot of this to the fact that they thought it was because China was such a weak nation. And so they vowed to make China strong. And so this small group of friends turned this kernel of an idea into this big movement that allowed them to eventually take over the country in just 20 years. Unfortunately, when they took over the nation, they did not succeed in making China strong. They in fact did the complete opposite. Because they were so married to ideology, they had many of the wrong people in place. They obviously had some of the wrong policies in place. And so this plummeted the nation into a state where millions of people died from starvation. In fact, more people died from that than in World War II. But fortunately, some of these folks, such as Deng Xiaoping, did not give up the dream of making China strong. They continued and persisted in trying out what would work for China. And through trial and error over many different policies, they finally came together and found a set of ideas that would help put China back on the right track. These set of ideas are basically what I discuss in my book. I wrote this book believing that these ideas would actually be workable in a democratic capitalist society, modified, but there are certain elements that are true for all societies. And while I realize that these two countries are very different, there are also many similarities. And I don't advocate everything China. What I'm talking about are some of the best practices of China that we can learn from. Because all nations have their weaknesses and strengths. And if we only dwell on the weaknesses, we are missing an opportunity to learn about what they do right. Because learning can be a two-way street. They've learned plenty from us, and we can learn from them. Because while the US is a very strong nation, we're still not perfect. We make many mistakes. And so if we can find a way to set aside our prejudices and take the best from the West and integrate them with the best of the East, perhaps we can advance civilization and create a better world for all. So I do cover a lot of ideas in my book, and I'm not going to have enough time to go over all of them. But I would like to highlight at least a couple major themes that I think are particularly relevant in the presidential election year. One of the ideas I discuss is the idea of leadership selection. Today, I think the United States is suffering from a crisis of leadership. Our politicians are polling at historic lows, Poll after poll show that. 60 Minutes recently reported that Congress had an approval rating of 9%. And movements such as Occupy Wall Street have been spreading like wildfire. These are very disturbing trends because as soon as a nation where the people do not think their government is legitimate, government could start taking more drastic actions in order to maintain the status quo and keep people in government in power. And we're starting to see signs of this. President Obama had signed a bill into law on New Year's Eve so that any American now can be detained indefinitely by the military without trial, without evidence. And this is actually a serious incursion into our civil rights. It makes it more important than ever now that we get the right leaders in place. And while we've had all sorts of attempts at campaign reform as a way to improve the system, 2008 still remains a record year where private money went into the election cycle. So that today democracy here is no longer really one person, one vote, but $1, one vote. So what can we learn from China in this regard, especially since most people regard the Chinese government as a dictatorship? Well, if you ask many folks outside of the US, in fact, you'll get a different opinion. Some people regard China as having the best technocrats in the world. And if you ask many of the Chinese citizens, they have very high approval ratings of their government. Pew Research out of DC here has conducted research polls, opinion polls in China for several years now, consistently showing that the opinion polls of the government have been hitting over 80%. And this approval rating seems to be in sharp contrast to the protests and over land grabs in the country. But those protesters tend to be very critical of their local government officials, not of the people who are running the show in China. So how did they get this level of legitimacy among their people? What can we learn? Well, the Chinese have a belief that the honor of running a nation should only belong to the people who have earned the right to do it. This idea of earned authority is very similar to the idea of a corporation where we don't elect a CEO to the top based on some popularity contest. No, the person who gets to run the organization has earned the right through an entire career proving that they have the skills and the knowledge to produce beneficial change. And so if you want to go work in the Chinese central government, you first have to take a competency test by the time you're 35. If you don't pass this test, then you must stay in the private sector. And this is a very difficult test. I personally have not seen it, but it has a pass rating of less than 20%. So right off the bat, they attract a lot of the brightest minds in China to go work for the government. And by having that cutoff, they restrict the conflict of interest that can happen between the private and public sector, something that we've seen in our own government. Now, once you become a government official there, you then are rotated to different positions in the government for 5-year terms, and you can't serve a position for more than 2 terms. And while you're in this position, you get evaluated 360 degrees a la McKinsey style. And then if you do well, you get promoted. And if you don't, you get demoted, and your compensation reflects that. And they try to do this so that they're